guys, how you doing? Luna here with a new video. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have something that could be considered an episode of the Overrated series because we're talking about one of the most mysterious and enigmatic albums that music has to offer. We're talking about the Smile Sessions by the Beach Boys or Brian Wilson, released in 2004 and in 2011 depending on the version we're talking about. But it was recorded all the way back in 1966, 1967, 40 years before its release. The thing with this record is that a lot of people argue that if finished in the 60s as it was supposed to be finished, this would be the greatest album of all time, even beating the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was the other contender for the title of the greatest album back in the 60s. Is this an exaggeration? Well, we have to look back at the story of the record. This record was supposed to be an answer, or the Beach Boys' response to the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but also to Revolver. After the success of Pet Sounds, Paul McCartney was inspired by the record, which led the band to do Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which at the time was considered to be the greatest achievement in music, not only because of the amazing production and performances showcased in the album, but most importantly because of the incredible creativity of the band at the time of writing the songs on this record, combining a bunch of different genres with rock music and creating one of the most interesting and unique albums even today, 50 years after it was released. This led Brian Wilson to start working on what he would call his masterpiece in 1966, and that will be Smile. This album was supposed to be the greatest achievement for the Beach Boys and in turn the greatest achievement in music in general. He planned to use everything that he learned with Pet Sounds and all the techniques he used in Pet Sounds and apply it to many different genres to create Smile. And the result was a lot of problems in the recordings and production of the record. First of all, Pet Sounds was an incredible album and it was acclaimed back then as it is acclaimed now. But the sales of the records weren't really that good. This meant a lot of financial problems for the band, and that along with Brian Wilson's decaying mental health led to the album being shelved even before it was finished. Many of the songs that were supposed to be on Smile were released later on albums like Smiley Smile, 2020 and Surf's Up, and the idea of the actual Smile album ever seeing release were dimmed out to the point where no one really cared about the album anymore. It was just like a big enigma of like what could have been of this record until 2004, where Brian Wilson decided to release the album as a solo artist with completely new recordings but the same ideas. The album enjoyed a lot of success, and actually it was like a renaissance in Brian Wilson's discography, which was basically dead or unproductive at the time of the release of Smile. Then the album had a reissue in 2011, this time with the original recordings from the Beach Boys in 1966 and 1967. However, people that worked on both the reissue in 2011 and the solo version by Brian Wilson in 2004 stated that this was not, the way that the original album was meant to be organized. Even though, both the 2004 and 2011 versions of the record have Brian Wilson as the director, as the one that arranged the whole album, I think it's pretty safe to say that given the fact that it's 40 years after the album was conceived, his ideas must have changed a lot. Brian Wilson in 2004 is not really the genius that he was back in 1967, so a lot of people use that to argue that if finished in 1967 by that Brian Wilson, it would have been way better. Fans constantly use the fact that Brian has said multiple times that the album isn't finished to argue that even though the record's great as it is, given the time to actually finish the album back in the 60s, it would have been the greatest record ever. But I think there's a few things that people misunderstand when, they're talking about the album. First of all, yes, the album was not finished, but that doesn't mean that the songs were not finished. I don't know if that makes any sense. So the tracks and the idea for the tracks and actually the instrumentals for the album were completely finished by the time it was shelved. The thing they weren't able to finish was recording the vocals, and that's true for only a few of the tracks in this record, like Heroes and Villains. But tracks like Our Prayer, tracks like Wonderful, tracks like Good Vibrations, Cavanescence, and a majority of the tracks in this record have fully completed vocals, which means that technically B, they're finished songs. So it's not like the album is only 60% completed. Actually, I would argue, based on what's been said about the record, that the record was like 85, 89% completed. I don't think that we're looking at a half-ass record. I think we're looking at a record that only needed a few more weeks to be completed. And I think that a lot of people believe that a lot of the instrumentals from this album were supposed to have vocals on them, but because the album's not finished, they don't have any. But that's not really the case. Most of the instrumentals on this record are meant to be instrumental. So people using, the unfinished word out of context to say this album might have been the greatest record ever if completed, it's not really an argument to be made. If you want to argue otherwise, then tell me why. In 2004, Brian Wilson re-recorded this entire album and it still sounds incredibly similar to what we get in 2011. Like, why is it that people argue that there's a lot of musical passages that were supposed to have lyrics and then they don't have lyrics even in the 2004 reissue of the record that was completely re-recorded? And I know a lot of people may be thinking right now that I don't really like the album when it's totally the opposite. In my opinion, the reissue of 2011 is one of the best Beach Boy records ever. And maybe is not as good as Pet Sounds. I don't really think so. I don't think that anyone sane could ever say something like that. But I do believe that it's a really, really good album worthy of a listen. I think it's an underrated record because a lot of people thinking that the album is just a compilation don't give it a chance when actually it's pretty much the fully fledged idea of the Smile album. Is just that, when organized in a different way. Or organized by 2004 Brian Wilson, if you want to see it that way. When it comes to the actual music of the album, this has to be one of the most interesting Beach Boys records ever. First of all, the intro track, Our Prayer, is one of the most hauntingly beautiful songs of the 60s and one of the most intense and incredible introductions to an album ever. And the way that G, this cover from one of the early rock and roll songs of the 40s or 30s, I don't remember, connects that hauntingly beautiful melody in Our Prayer to the rock and roll nature of a Beach Boys song with heroes and villains is genius. Is an amazing way to kickstart the album. And actually, some of the best Beach Boys songs are found in this record. You have Cavanescence, which is my favorite track from the album, and actually, I'm gonna say it, my favorite Beach Boys song. I don't think it's the best. I think that goes to Good Vibrations and a song like God Only Knows, for example. But if you ask me my favorite, it has to be Cavanescence. The way they combine one of the most beautiful melodies the Beach Boys has ever made with that intro, where it's only the voice and the piano, and then it goes into that chaotic, weird musical passage that it's so hard to describe, but it's so distorted. You have all these harmonies that are playing into the distortion. It's just so good. Cavanescence, definitely a great song. You can also find that song in 2020, and a lot of people say Cavanescence was supposed to be way better. It finished, but in 2020, it sounds exactly the same. 2020, I mean the album, not the year, by the way. Even the covers in this album sound really good. For example, My Only Sunshine was just originally meant to be an uplifting song, but Brian put his own twist on it, making it a really sad song by pitching it down. Then you have a track like Surf's Up, which is one of my favorite Beach Boys songs. It's a really powerful song too. I think a lot of people overlook the track and don't actually read into it because they think it's just your typical nice tune by the Beach Boys, but honestly, go back and listen to that track and actually pay attention to the lyrics and how the track is structured, because I think it's just a really powerful song, honestly. And lyrically, it's just one of the most interesting ones the Beach Boys have to offer. Speaking about interesting lyrical concepts, you also have Wonderful on this album, which paints this picture of this lady who's trying to explore her sexuality. Is feeling really intrigued by it, but at the same time feels like, she's committing a sin, and tries to bring both his religion and her sexual life together without it clashing against each other. So I think that's a really interesting one. It's also a really beautiful track when it comes to melody and instrumentation. And you have Good Vibrations, which I'm pretty sure you all know that track. It's not only one of the most popular tracks ever, it's also one of the most important tracks that pop music has to offer. The way that it modified music, it's something that it's definitely worth research. And if you want, I can even make a video about that track because there's so much to deconstruct, the way that the song is a pop song, but it has a different structure that most songs had at the time. It's just an amazing track, and it's obviously a highlight on this album. But overall, you have so many good songs on this record. Why is it that I don't really support the fact that this album is such a legend, or has this whole lore behind it, of it being the greatest record never made? Pretty much the way you want to describe a concept album. It's an album that doesn't have any unnecessary songs, an album where every track fulfills a purpose, and that is exactly the opposite to what Smile is. Both the Brian Wilson version or the reissue of 2011, both have songs that could perfectly, not be there. Child is the father of the man, for example. What's the point of that track being there? Vegetables, written vegetables, is just not a good track either, or at least I don't like it. You have some instrument, my problem is not with the instrumentals on this album. In my opinion, tracks like Holiday, for example, is a good song. I like it. When Chimes is a good song, I like too. But at the same time, tracks like Barnyard, for example, yeah, I don't like that one. And again, for whoever wants to come at me saying that the album is not finished, I have stated multiple times in this video that the thing that's not finished about the album is the recordings of the vocals. It's not really the instrumental or the ideas for the track. Even if you were to add the most beautiful melody of some of these instrumentals, they wouldn't really work because they're not connected to the rest of the album, in my opinion. Songs like Workshop, what the fuck is that? Like, how can you add lyrics to this song and then just connect it to the rest of the album? It doesn't matter what you would say. Even the title doesn't make any sense. And while I can admit that this is a great record, comparing it to some of the greatest albums ever made, that's a lot, and I don't think it deserves that comparison. It's a great album. Go ahead and check it out. It's unique, it's beautiful, it's interesting, it's even well produced, especially if we go to the Brian Wilson's 2004 reissue. But listen, it's not one of the greatest albums of all time, and yes, it's an unfinished record, but I think we can all agree that it's mostly finished. It was only an inch away of being completed. It just needed a few more recordings. That's it, and that's not enough to make a great album, one of the greatest ever. So yeah, that's my opinion on this record, and that's my opinion on this whole myth behind the album. Which version do I like the most, the 2011 or the 2004? I would definitely say 2011 because he has the original voices, the original recordings. I think it's pretty safe to say that the Beach Boys sounded way better in 1967 than they did in 2004. So yeah, that's the main reason why. The 2004 version is way better in terms of production. It's finished, it has finished the vocal recordings. The 2011 doesn't, because it's pretty much the 1966, 1967 recording session. So it's not, fully finished, but still, I would argue that it still sounds way better because the voices, especially Brian Wilson's voice was way more melodic back then. So yeah, I rather the 2011 version. That'll be it for today's video, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. I know that, talking about this album is quite controversial, and, talking about the Beach Boys overall gets a lot of people really triggered. But hey, listen, this is my opinion, so if you have your own, please go ahead and leave it down below in the comments. If you think I made any mistakes or if I, quoted something wrong, go ahead and leave it down below. I'm open to criticism. Last video I made about the Beach Boys was actually Sgt. Pepper's versus Pet Sounds, comparing the two albums, and a lot of people were fucking going crazy about the fact that I said that Revolver inspired Pet Sounds, saying that it was actually Rubber Soul because Revolver was released after Pet Sounds. I'm fully aware of when Revolver was released, okay? I know that it was released afterwards, but if you actually research a little bit more, deeply into the subject, you'll know that Brian Wilson was able to listen to a few of the songs from Revolver before it was released, and those songs that he listened to, I don't know which ones, it's never stated, were one of the main inspirations for Pet Sounds. That's the reason why I said it, okay? Sorry. With that being said, once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you guys soon with a new video. But until then, bye.